Yes, so very happy to be here. And well, I'm, as Hendrik said, from KTH. And in that environment, kind of a strange animal, maybe because I have a background in ethnomusicology. So despite the fact that I'm there at a technical university, I have a background in humanities, and so I do a lot of engineering stuff in the sound and music computing area, but also ethnography, mainly in Crete, which is what I'm going to talk about here and today. So I will start introducing a little bit about the performance context that we have in Crete, and I will talk to you about my research question that I have in that work that is related to my field work. So in Cretan performance context, so in the island of Crete in Greece, there are several performance contexts. For example, one example is the so-called parea, which is the probably most participatory music performance framework, so to say, in social gatherings. So that's a key notion all over Greece. And it is a very important framework for acquisition and learning of the repertoire. So that is very informal, a very informal context. And in my study, I have a look at the so-called glendi or panieri, as depending on the area how you would call it, which is a more formal framework. So it's publicly announced events, mostly happening during the summer, in village squares or schoolyards. Many people taking part in that. Small villages very often organizing events for people, like 1,000 visitors, dancers coming to these festivities. These festivities usually last from the late evening until the morning hours, and you have an elevated stage, as you probably can see here. There's an elevated stage here in the PA system. And there's in this performance context, there's a participatory character mostly regarding the dance, with differentiation in the degree depending on period and area. But there's always a large, it's a bit, between the tables where all these people are seated and the stage, there's a usually very large dance floor. And my research questions with which it's probably a lie if I say that I go into the field with research questions. I usually come out of the field with them and then go back and so on. But the questions that I will talk about here is, so how do repertoire choices and rhythmic processes provide structure to an event on a large and on a short time scale, respectively? And how do dancers participate in shaping rhythmic processes and musical form? So how does something that looks like a more concert setting actually have a strongly participatory character through the participation of the dancers? I will, as I said, have a look specifically at the glendi. I will have a focus on a certain repertoire, which are the sirtos and the leaping dances, two forms of dances that are very common in Crete. And I will focus on specific regions and a selection of renowned musicians. After some years of field work, I focused on some specific areas here now in this talk. So I will show some musical examples a little bit later. So because there's not so much time, I will just present in words shortly what is the Cretan sirtos, for example. So as most Cretan dances, also this dance is danced in an open circle counterclockwise. And the dance has origins in Western Crete, and it has quite specific structure, an A-B structure. So it is made up of two melodies. One tune is made up of two melodies. And these tunes are combined to longer series where, for example, this would be the first tune, it would be repeated several times. Lyrics would be arranged to these two parts, and then the musicians put the next tune, which is very often, or which may be spontaneously, but there are also very common sequences of these tunes. On the other hand, we have leaping dances, which are a musical form based on melodic phrases of 2 or 4 measures length. And the players here in this form continuously elaborate the phrases and frequently introduce new phrases from the large repertoire of dance-related phrases. And compared to the sirtos, this form is more flexible because it does not have this fixed A-B structure that is necessarily repeated to some extent, but it provides a large degree of freedom to the musician to also react to the dancers. There are several leaping dances in Crete. Here in my talk we will encounter 2 of them. The pithiktos, I will not go into the naming of these dances because then the confusion will be complete. But I will just mention that there is the pithiktos, which is basically consisting of a lot of local variations and which is mainly from Central and Eastern Crete, whereas the pendosalis is another leaping dance with roots in Western Crete. The material that I have a look at is coming from 2 areas, basically. I had a look at 3 events from one area rather in the east of Crete, so at slightly north of the Lassithi Plateau, which is right here. And 1 event in Kissamos, which is a very strong violin tradition, or which has a very strong violin tradition still nowadays, in the very west of Crete. So in these events we recorded with multiple video cameras and audio recordings at 2 positions, which enabled me to do quite elaborate analysis also posterior after the experience in the field. So the methods that I use then to have a look at my research questions is I annotate form and duration of tunes throughout these whole events. And each of these events lasts between the durations of these events is between 5 and 8 hours. I compute tempo curves and rhythm patterns. So that is the slightly computational approach here, where I have a look at how the tempo proceeds and which kind of rhythmic patterns are maybe there in the recordings. And based on these observations, I also conduct interviews with the involved performers in what I call a collaborative performance analysis, where I have a look at the performance recordings together with the performers and have an analysis together with them regarding what is happening in the dance while watching the video of the dancers in specific parts and performances that, for example, that emerged as specific or particular in my previous analysis. And I also did some things that I will maybe not talk about today because of the time, but the video recordings also enabled me to look at the gaze directions between the musicians in order to get at least some indicator for where the focus of the attention of the musician lies upon, in order to see how the communication within the band works, so to speak, or also towards the dancers, so how much of the attention might be directed towards the dancers. Okay, so what do I get here? So as I said, I chose 4 events, one of these being from the west of Crete, and I annotated the musical material that that was performed in these events. And one thing that is not astonishing after years of field work is that the sirtos, the first dance that we focus upon, takes the majority. That's in all of these figures here, the black part of the cake. So that's the largest extent of a festivity consists of a sirtos in Crete. That's a phenomenon that is common all over Crete. So that's something that I wouldn't have needed to count so much for that. So it's probably not necessary to quantify each and every qualitative insight. But something that I understood by counting actually is the importance of breaks. So we can see that the break, which is the second most frequent part of the repertoire, so to speak, in a Cretan event, is in particular very frequent in the first event. And that directed my attention to the fact that these breaks are actually very important moments of interactions between musicians and audience, where also economic interactions take place, such as placing orders to which pieces should be played next and so on. And interestingly, these kinds of economical interactions are most intense in the west of Crete. And here the breaks take the largest proportion. So there's a very important factor here, these interactions between musicians and dancers before playing a dance and ordering and arranging the next piece. Another thing that, that emerges out of these number exercise is that the smallest proportion of the pithithos is in event 1, which is the leaping dance from west and east, whereas the pendosalis, which is the leaping dance from the west, takes the largest proportion. So I came up then having a look at these two events, comparing the sequences that go on there and taking the breaks kind of as the start and the ending point of a sequence that is going on. And comparing these two models here, I can see that it is the, let's say, the thickness of these arrows kind of is immediately related to the numbers of transitions that I saw in these events. And we can see that this upper right thing here is always the most frequent, it's the most frequent sequence in the events. And we can see a difference that there's always a break, a sirtos, and then we go to a leaping dance that kind of increases the intensity of the dance activity further compared to the sirtos. But in the west of Crete, we have the local leaping dance being prominent, and in the east of Crete, the eastern leaping dance. So that's a lot about the overall structure of the event and how certain things about the audience and the location might affect the structure of such an event. But what is happening then regarding rhythm and tempo? So I annotated tempo trajectories. So what we see here in this figure is basically for two events in comparison. So again, event 1 is the one from the west and event 2 is one from the east. We see how in average the sirtos proceeds in tempo from the beginning of a sira, so from the beginning of these combinations of tunes, towards the end of the sira. And we can see that they are very similar, despite the repertoire being played. It is, in both cases, sirtos, it is very similar melodies. But they are, in these two events, in the west and in the east, they are played with almost non-overlapping tempi, despite being apparently related to the same form of dance. And in each event, I observe that typically the tempo approaches a final tempo value in all of these performances that seem to be the point of accumulation for the specific musicians that are there performing, which you can see that this thing here that denotes the variance in the measures kind of gets smaller towards the end. So it kind of goes to an end point where the performers reach the highest point in tempo. But there's something strange going on here, which is again something where I obtained a new insight by counting that I was not aware of doing field work. And that is that tempo increases steadily for event 2 and also for event 3 and 4 that I do not show here, but not for event 1. So I wondered what is going on there and had a closer look. So here we have phenomena such as this. So this is a particular performance then from event 1. So we have things like these dotted lines here denote the tune boundaries. So this is one tune of A-B combinations. Then the musicians go to a transition to the next tune and so on. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tunes here. The black thing denotes the tempo curve. And we can see that there is a strong relation between the musical structure of the cirtos changes and how the tempo develops. But what is interesting is that the tempo interacts more importantly actually here in this case with dance activity, which I will show in 2 videos now. So my hypothesis that is here that the more formal organization that we have actually in the west of Crete still, which is not so much present in the festivities in the east, actually facilitates a more immediate interaction between the musicians and the dancers, and this is what emerges as these kind of unusual tempo proceedings. So let's have a look at how the first tempo increase here, this very steep tempo increase emerges. Watch the first dancer. He clearly indicates to the musicians to lift it up. And we are here now in the first tune. So the musicians react by a tune change and lift up the tempo, which enables the dancer to improvise. And he still wants more. He again gestures, and now we are here. It's actually fantastic to watch that video in half speed and to observe how the melody and the steps of the dancers go together. It is beautiful. But at the end, I said that we have this tempo decrease. So what is happening there? We're now somewhere here. There's an inexperienced dancer here. And he called for another more experienced dancer to help him a little bit, learning the steps actually. And the musicians observe that point again and decrease the tempo in order to facilitate this kind of online dancing lesson that is going on there in this festivity right now. So this is a kind of participatory creation of the musical form that is going on, and that is very strong as far as I can observe, especially in events where this immediate interaction is facilitated through a relatively small number of dancers here. Now I will show you a slightly confusing figure maybe. I won't explain it. actually a little bit, okay, but this looks like a spectrogram, but it actually isn't. So this is a perspective on rhythmic patterns. So time is here on this axis, and I only want to say that on this axis there is something related to tempo, and black lines kind of show us if a certain periodicity, a certain repetition at that specific tempo is very intense or not. So what we can see in this figure, for example, is that the leaping dances in event 1, so the lute pattern that is very strong in its intensity, is actually the playing of the lute in the West, at least in this group of musicians, is actually quite differently shaped than this one, which is a more equally weighted strumming, so just an up and down strumming without any patterning actually. But what I want to direct your attention to is, for example, here we have a relatively equally spaced pattern of black lines, but here in the end suddenly we have something that shows an increase of density to the double. So here basically the musicians, or mainly the lute, which is grasped by this representation, increases the intensity of strokes a lot. So this directed my attention to the following sequence. So this is exactly that part, and I will again show you the video so you can see what is happening there. So what was happening here, and that is actually, that was an outcome of my collaborative performance analysis, so my conversations with a musician. So the lyra player actually playing in that performance, Achadis Spiridakis, he told me that what they are doing there in this moment, this increase of density that I notated here, the lute strokes and the lyra notes, is actually performed in order to enable the dancer whom they observe dancing alone in the middle of the circle to start spinning. So actually they observe the dancer and increase this, their rhythmic patterning in order to enable the dancer to facilitate this kind of dance movement. So just these were some examples. So let me just discuss a little bit what is happening here in the research that I'm trying to do. So I'm combining a variety of methods, which is participant observation, interviews with dancers, musicians, yes, artistic practice. So I play lute and dance myself. This posterior video analysis, the annotation of events, and computational audio analysis. So that's a bunch of different things, and I try to think about how these things work together. And in my experience, so that's basically what I'm doing here. I'm going through a circle that relates empirical phases with theoretical phases. So ethnography, reshaping methods, then an empirical phase that is a corpus analysis, or rather a computational thing, and then back to reshaping and comparing key concepts, and then again back to the field and start from the beginning, refine, re-ask questions. So this approach is motivated by ideas of semiology of music as discussed by Molino and Natiez. And I think that a combination of perspectives, such as through ethnography, artistic practice, and computational analysis, facilitate a triangulation between ethnography, corpus study, and historical background. I will take 2 or 3 more minutes just to give my personal point of view on computation. So computation is rather the method of counting. So it's not about computers necessarily. So the computation may be the act of mathematical calculation, which is, in the simplest case, the method of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and writing a number. Not necessarily the use of computers. So in this wider sense, a fundamental question may be if counting and data representations derived from it may enable to discover how fine details in performance bear social meaning. As a quote by Perlman, the more detailed our technical analysis, the more opportunities we will have to show how sounds and contexts are subtly intertwined. I think that general corpus studies should be considered in combination with data particularities. If we just go for some general data distributions, we don't get to the specific moments that are kind of peculiar, and these are, in my experience, the ones that are interesting when trying to reshape my research questions to go back to the field. And in the end, I mean, statistics can arrive at correlation, while I would claim that in research in ethnography, I can get a stronger picture towards causality by speaking with musicians and performing myself. Thank you.